When I called my daughter to ask what time dinner was starting, she paused just long enough for me to hear the music in the background. Not dinner party music, a live band. She cleared her throat and said, "Oh, Dad, we moved it to Saturday. Didn't I tell you? It's just the immediate family anyway. Nothing fancy." I said okay. I told her to give my love to my grandson. I hung up the phone and sat alone in my kitchen, listening to the house settle around me the way old houses do, like they're breathing. 3 weeks later, my daughter and her husband were standing at the end of my driveway with their luggage, nowhere to go, and I was the only person left on earth they could call. I looked at them through the front window for a long moment. Then I walked to the door and told them what I should have said 30 years ago. Before I get to that, let me tell you how a man who built homes for 4 decades almost lost everything he ever built to the people living inside one. My name doesn't matter as much as my hands do. These hands framed houses in 3 states. They poured concrete in July heat and hung drywall in January cold. I spent 41 years as a general contractor in North Carolina, building custom homes for people who wanted something that would outlast them. I retired at 62 with a paid-off property outside Asheville, a rental duplex on the edge of town that brought in steady income, and enough in a retirement account to live quietly and decently for the rest of my life. I wasn't rich, but I was free. That's a different kind of wealth that most people don't recognize until they've lost it. My daughter is my only child. When she married her husband 14 years ago, I welcomed him. I taught him to change his own oil, hung shelves in their first apartment, co-signed the loan on their house when the bank said their credit wasn't quite there yet. Over the years, when things got tight, I helped. Always quietly, always without making them feel small about it. Because that's what fathers do. They fill the gaps. They load bear without asking for credit. My grandson, Caleb, is 18 years old and the best person in our family. He graduated high school in May with honors and a partial scholarship to NC State. He wants to be an environmental engineer. He talks about watersheds and soil erosion the way I used to talk about load calculations and roof pitch, with that particular fire that only comes from finding out what you were born to do. I had been planning his graduation gift for 6 months, a vintage transit level I'd tracked down from an estate sale in Raleigh, the kind of instrument old surveyors used before everything went digital, the kind of thing you pass down. My daughter called 2 days before graduation. She said they were doing a small family dinner at a restaurant downtown. Nothing big. She said Caleb wanted to keep it low-key. She said traffic downtown would be a nightmare for me at that hour, and parking was brutal. And honestly, Dad, you know how loud those places get, and maybe I'd enjoy it more if I came over Sunday instead when things had settled down. She said it with that voice she's been using since she was 16, smooth and reasonable, the voice that made every manipulation sound like a favor she was doing me. I said I understood. I said Sunday sounded fine. I told her to hug Caleb for me. An hour later, my phone buzzed with a notification. A woman from my church, a grandmother herself, had commented on a photo. I tapped the notification out of habit. The photo was of a banquet hall draped in blue and gold, Caleb's school colors. There were balloons and a catered buffet and a DJ set up in the corner, and at least 150 people I recognized, colleagues of my son-in-law, neighbors, people from the country club my daughter had joined 3 years ago, people I had never seen before in my life. Caleb was standing in the center of it, wearing his graduation gown, holding his diploma, smiling the smile of a boy who had learned to perform happiness for other people's cameras. He wasn't looking at the lens. He was looking slightly to the left of it, the way people do when they're searching a crowd for someone who isn't there. I put my phone down on the counter. I walked to the garage. I sat on the step stool I kept out there for when I needed to think without any furniture being too comfortable. I thought for a long time, not about what they had done, about what they had decided I was. They had looked at me, a 63-year-old man who had poured the concrete they walked on, and they had decided I was a liability, an embarrassment, a man in worn work boots, who would say the wrong thing to the right person at the wrong moment. They had weighed me and found me inconvenient. I drove to the high school the next afternoon and waited in the parking lot for Caleb. He came out with a stack of returned papers and a look on his face like he'd been carrying something heavy all week. When he saw my truck, he stopped. Then he walked over fast, the way kids do when they're relieved but trying not to show it. He got in. He didn't say anything for a second. I asked him if he'd had a good party. He said, "Grandpa, I didn't know until Thursday that you weren't invited. I thought you just weren't coming. Mom told me she'd talked to you and you weren't feeling up to it." I told him I was feeling fine. He nodded slowly, staring at his hands. Then he said, "Dad's been stressed. There's some deal he's working on." He kept telling Mom this dinner was about networking. He had some investors there. He didn't want. He stopped. I waited. He said you'd make it weird. He said you'd talk about construction and people would think we were, you know. He couldn't finish it. I reached into the back seat and handed him the transit level in its worn leather case. I told him it was made in 1961. I told him a good instrument doesn't go out of date just because newer ones exist. I told him to keep it somewhere his parents wouldn't see it. He held it against his chest and didn't let go the whole drive home. I dropped him off 2 blocks from the house. When I got back to my property, I didn't cry. I built things for 4 decades. I learned a long time ago that emotion is useful, but sentiment is dangerous. A house has to be level before it can be beautiful. I needed to be level first. I opened my laptop and logged into the account I used to manage my rental duplex. My daughter and her husband had been handling the property for me for 2 years, collecting rent, managing small repairs, depositing income. It had seemed like a reasonable arrangement at the time. They lived nearby. I was slowing down, and they said they wanted to help. I had trusted them with the login because that's what family does. The income history showed 8 months of deposits that were exactly $200 less than they should have been. Not random variation. Exactly 200 every single month. I sat very still looking at that number. $200 is small enough that a man might not notice. Small enough to look like fees, processing charges, maintenance costs. Small enough to slip past the attention of an older man who trusts his family. I called a man I'd worked with for 30 years named Pete, who had retired from contracting to do property accounting and bookkeeping. I told him I needed him to look at something. He was at my kitchen table by 7 o'clock that evening. By 9, Pete had found 4 separate lines of unusual activity going back 26 months. Small transfers, slightly irregular timing, always just under the threshold that would trigger an automatic bank alert. Total amount, just over $11,000. Not dramatic, not catastrophic, precise, patient. The kind of theft that only works if no one is paying attention. I thanked Pete. I told him to keep this between us. He looked at me across the table and said, "You want me to call someone?" I told him not yet. I needed to know how deep the hole went before I decided what to pour into it. The next morning I drove to First Federal Bank where I'd held my accounts for 27 years. I walked past the teller line directly to the desk of the branch manager, a woman named Diane who had handled my business accounts since I started the company. She looked up and I saw something cross her face that I didn't like. Not surprise. Something more like relief that the moment had come. The way people look when they've been waiting for a hard conversation to finally arrive. She told me she was glad I'd come in. She told me there were some things on my account she'd been wanting to discuss. She said a representative had come in 8 weeks ago with a notarized power of attorney document and a letter from a physician stating that I was experiencing early cognitive impairment affecting my ability to manage my own finances. She said the representative had used that documentation to establish secondary account access and had requested that all paper statements be suspended and replaced with electronic delivery only. I asked her who the representative was. She turned her monitor toward me. My son-in-law's name was on the authorization form, and beneath it, in a clean notarized signature, was mine. Except I had never signed it. I don't remember the drive home. I remember sitting in the driveway for a long time looking at the house I'd built myself in 1994. I poured the foundation of that house by hand. I cut every rafter. I set every tile. When you build something yourself, you know exactly where its weaknesses are. You know which joints need checking after a hard winter. You know which beam is carrying more than its share. For 30 years I had watched this house and kept it sound. And for the last 26 months, while I thought my family was helping me carry it, they had been quietly pulling out the nails. The physician who had signed the cognitive impairment letter was listed as a Dr. M. Blanchard. I ran the name that evening. No license on file with the North Carolina Medical Board. No practice, no address, no history. Just a name on a piece of paper bought from somewhere that sells names on pieces of paper for people with problems too specific to ask for help with legally. I called an attorney, not a local general practice firm. I called a woman named Carol Stites, who had spent 22 years in the Financial Crimes Division of the State Attorney General's office before going private. My old accountant had used her once, said she was the kind of lawyer who didn't ask permission to be thorough. I told her what I had. She told me to come in tomorrow and to bring every document in my possession. I arrived at her office at 8 in the morning with a banker's box. She read in silence for an hour while I drank bad coffee from a machine in the hallway. Then she set everything down and looked at me over her reading glasses. She said the forged power of attorney alone was a felony. The false physician letter elevated it to fraud by deception. The siphoning from the rental account was larceny. And the secondary account access, once we established it had been used to redirect funds, would bring wire fraud into the picture. I asked her if there was more. She turned her monitor toward me. She said she had started running preliminary searches while I was in the hallway. My duplex property, the rental unit I owned free and clear, had a lien filed against it 4 months ago. A home equity line of credit in the amount of $160,000 had been opened using the property as collateral. The signatory on the loan application was Wallace A. Morrison, my full name. I had never applied for that loan. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I think people expect anger, and anger did come, but it came later. What I felt first was a particular kind of grief that doesn't have a common name. It's the grief of realizing that someone you loved has been treating you like a problem to be managed. That while you were calling to check on them, they were in a room somewhere deciding how to use you. That the care you offered freely was being inventoried and monetized. I thought about every check I had written, every loan co-signed. Every Saturday I had driven over to fix something in their house without being asked. And I thought about the way my son-in-law had looked at me at Christmas 2 years ago, a long appraising look I hadn't understood at the time, the look of a man calculating remaining value. I told Carol to prepare everything she needed. I told her I didn't want to rush. She asked me what I meant. I said I wanted them to feel safe first. She smiled the way lawyers smile when a client says something that saves them an explanation. I drove home and did not call my daughter. I did not call my son-in-law. I sent a brief text that said I was fine, that I'd been tired lately, that I was thinking about what we had discussed about letting them take a more active role in managing my finances. I said, it sounded like a good idea at my age. I said we should sit down soon. My son-in-law replied in under 4 minutes. He said that sounded great. He said he was glad I was coming around. He said he'd put together some paperwork for me to review. I set my phone down and went to the garage and worked on an old cabinet I'd been refinishing, because men who build things know that the best thinking happens when your hands are busy. Over the next 10 days, Carol worked. She pulled records, cross-referenced signatures, tracked the origin of the false physician document to a notary mill operating out of a strip of office suites in Charlotte that had already been flagged twice by the state bar. She found that the $160,000 line of credit had been drawn down almost completely. $38,000 went to pay off a personal credit card. $40,000 went to a private LLC my son-in-law had registered 18 months ago under a name that had nothing to do with any business he'd ever described to me. The rest was scattered across transfers in amounts small enough to seem casual and large enough to matter. The LLC was called Clear Horizon Ventures. I had never heard of it. When Carol dug deeper, she found it was involved in a real estate development scheme on the western edge of Asheville, buying distressed parcels and flipping them on paper to generate short-term income. The scheme required constant cash infusion to stay solvent. The cash had run out. My son-in-law had borrowed against my property to buy himself another quarter and was now several months behind on the LLC's debts. Carol told me his creditors were already circling. She said without new capital, he had perhaps 60 days before the whole thing collapsed and every creditor with a lien would start calling in favors. I asked her if one of those creditors could be me. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, I was hoping you would ask that. She had already contacted the primary lender, holding the fraudulent note on my duplex. The bank, once presented with the evidence of forgery, was eager to transfer the non-performing loan rather than litigate a fraud case that would make the news. Within 48 hours, through a holding company Carol established under the name Foundation Ridge LLC, I became the owner of my own debt. I held the note. I held the lien. I held the acceleration clause that allowed me to demand full repayment immediately upon evidence of fraud. I also spent 2 days quietly transferring the accounts my son-in-law knew about into a new structure that Carol managed as trustee. I left enough in the old accounts to look normal. I needed them to feel like nothing had changed. My grandson called me on a Tuesday evening. He said his parents had been acting strange. He said his mother had been crying behind closed doors, and his father had been on the phone constantly, pacing the kitchen at midnight. He asked if I knew what was going on. I told him to come over Saturday morning. I told him I'd make breakfast and explain some things that he was old enough to hear. He arrived at 8. I made eggs and told him the truth. Not everything, because some things a grandson doesn't need to carry, but enough. I told him the money his parents had been promising for his college expenses, the money they'd told him was being held in a family account and would be available when school started, was not there. I told him not to panic. I told him I had already established a separate account in his name through Carol's office that was protected and sufficient for 4 years of tuition and expenses, and that neither of his parents could touch it. He stared at his plate for a long time. He's a quiet kid when things matter. Finally, he said, "Did they know it was wrong?" I told him yes. He nodded. He ate his eggs. After a while, he said, "What are you going to do?" I told him I was going to let his father walk to the edge of the cliff first, and then I was going to make sure he understood exactly why he was standing there. The week before everything came apart, I called my daughter and invited them both to dinner. I said I'd been thinking about the future, and I wanted to sit down and talk about getting some things organized. I said I appreciated everything they'd been doing, and I wanted to make sure we were all on the same page going forward. My son-in-law suggested that we meet at the duplex property, said it would be easier to look over the paperwork there. I agreed. I told Carol the meeting was set. She told me she would have everything ready. The night before the meeting, I sat on my back porch and watched the dark move across the tree line. I was not angry by then. I had moved through anger and out the other side into something quieter. There's a concept in construction called controlled demolition. You don't swing a wrecking ball blindly at a building. You study the structure. You identify the load-bearing elements. You place your charges at the precise points where the collapse will be clean, contained, and irreversible. What I was about to do was not revenge. It was engineering. They arrived at the duplex together at 6 o'clock. My son-in-law was in a good suit. He carried a leather portfolio with a real estate attorney's letterhead on the tab, a man I would later learn he had paid a retainer to with money drawn from a cash advance on one of my credit cards. My daughter wore the practiced smile she kept for moments when she needed me to feel flattered by her attention. She brought a casserole dish wrapped in foil. She set it on the counter and looked around the duplex with the proprietary ease of a woman who had already decided the property was hers. I thanked her for the food. I told them to sit down. My son-in-law opened his portfolio. He said he wanted to walk me through a proposal for reclassifying the duplex as an asset held in a family management trust, which would give them operational control and tax advantages while I retained nominal ownership. He said it was really the smart move for a man in my position. He said it was exactly the kind of planning that protected families from probate complications. He pushed the first document across the table. I looked at it. I didn't pick it up. I reached into my jacket pocket and placed a single sheet of paper, face up, on the table between us. My daughter looked at it. Her face didn't change at first. Then it did. It was the bank statement showing the $11,000 in systematic transfers from the rental account. My son-in-law said that was easily explained. He said there were management fees, maintenance accruals, an administrative charge structure that he'd meant to explain to me, and it had just slipped through the cracks with everything so busy. He was already building the explanation, stacking the words up like boards, trying to cover the gap before I could see through it. I placed a second sheet on the table. The loan application for the $160,000 line of credit, with the forensic handwriting report paper clipped to the back. The report was 9 pages long. The summary on the first page said the signature did not match my current signing pattern in 14 separate measurable characteristics. It said the signature was consistent with a traced copy of a document from 2014. The room was quiet. My daughter said, "Dad." She said it the way people say a word when they're trying to decide what comes after it. My son-in-law said the report was inaccurate. He said signatures change over time. He said I had signed that document, that I had sat right there, that I was confused, that this was the exact thing they had been worried about, that this was why they were trying to help me get organized, that I couldn't manage these things on my own anymore and I was going to hurt myself. He leaned forward. He put his hand over mine on the table. I looked at his hand. I placed a third sheet on the table. It was the physician declaration he had submitted to the bank. I had highlighted the name at the bottom. I told him there was no doctor, Blanchard licensed in the state of North Carolina. I told him there was no doctor, Blanchard licensed in any neighboring state. I told him the document had been traced to a notary operation that was currently under investigation by the state bar. He took his hand off mine. My daughter stood up. She said this wasn't fair. She said she had been managing my affairs for 2 years, and I had never once said thank you, never acknowledged the time and effort, never treated her like she was doing anything beyond the minimum expected of a daughter. She said I had always made her feel like she wasn't enough, and this, all of this, was her trying to build something for their family, for her son, for their future. And yes, she knew some of the methods were unconventional, but the intent was for everyone. She was crying by the end of it. Real tears. The kind that come when a person finally decides to believe their own story. I let her finish. Then I placed the last document on the table. It was the foreclosure notice from Foundation Ridge, LLC. It named my son-in-law as the mortgaged party, specified the fraudulent origination of the loan, and invoked the acceleration clause demanding repayment of the full outstanding balance within 72 hours. My son-in-law picked it up. He read it twice. He said he didn't know this company. He said this was some kind of mistake. He said he had 60 days. His attorney had told him he had 60 days. There had to be a process. I told him. Foundation Ridge LLC had purchased the note from the bank 6 days ago and had exercised its legal right to accelerate repayment based on documented fraud. I told him they were welcome to speak with the company's counsel. He asked who Foundation Ridge was. I told him that was me. The sound that came out of my son-in-law in that moment wasn't anger, and it wasn't grief. It was the sound of a man feeling the floor drop out from under him. He stood up. He knocked his portfolio off the table. He pointed at me and said things I won't repeat, because they were the words of a frightened man trying to find something solid to grab onto, and frightened men in that state are not really saying anything worth recording. My daughter reached for my arm. She said, "Dad, please. We can work this out. We are family." I told her I agreed. I told her that was exactly why I had handled it this way instead of going directly to the police. I told her I still had the option to file a criminal complaint and that Carol had already prepared the documentation for the district attorney's office should I choose to do so. I told them they had until the following morning to make a decision. I told them to get out of my property. My son-in-law left without looking at my daughter. He walked to his car and drove away alone. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, holding the foil-wrapped casserole dish she had brought, and the expression on her face was one of the saddest things I have ever seen, because it was the face of a woman realizing for the first time that her husband had been building an exit from the marriage while she thought they were building a future together. I wanted to say something to her. I wanted to be her father in that moment, but she had made choices that had consequences, and the kindest thing I could do for her was make sure she understood that clearly. She left. I called Carol. She had been parked 1 block away the entire time. She came inside and we went through the next steps. She filed the fraud report with the district attorney's office the following morning. The detective assigned to the case had worked financial crimes for 11 years and told Carol the documentation was among the cleaner fraud files she'd seen. My son-in-law was arrested at his office 3 days later. He was charged with forgery, bank fraud, and elder financial abuse, which in North Carolina carries mandatory minimums that his attorney spent the next 6 months trying to negotiate down. My daughter cooperated. She hadn't known the extent of everything, though she had known enough. She knew about the rental account transfers. She knew the physician letter was not legitimate. She chose to look away because the life they were building felt too important to examine too closely. She took a plea arrangement that required community service, restitution, and 2 years of supervised probation. She lost her job. She lost the house, which she had never truly owned anyway once the fraudulent liens were settled. She called me 2 weeks after the arrest, from her mother's house where she was staying while she figured out what came next. She didn't ask me to take it back. She didn't try to rewrite it. She just said she was sorry, and that she needed some time, and that she hoped eventually I would be willing to talk. I told her I loved her. I told her that hadn't changed. I told her some things take as long as they take and I would be here. Caleb started at NC State in August. I drove him up on a Tuesday, the bed of my truck loaded with everything he needed. He carried the transit level in his backpack. He wouldn't put it with the boxes. When we got to his dormitory and carried everything up the stairs, he stopped at the door and turned around and hugged me for a long time, the way a kid does when they're leaving, and they want to hold on to something real before they go. I told him to call me when he figured out the watershed project. I told him I wanted to hear everything about it. I drove home alone through the mountains, and the late August light was doing something extraordinary to the tree line, golden green the way it gets, when the summer is almost done, and the air starts to remember what autumn smells like. I had the windows down. People have asked me how I could do what I did to my own family. I understand the question. It comes from a decent place, but I think it gets the sequence backwards. I didn't do something to my family. My family did something, and I chose not to pretend otherwise. I chose not to fill the gap this time. Not because I stopped caring, but because the deepest care I had left to give was the truth, served plainly and without softening. A house built on a bad foundation doesn't need more walls. It needs someone willing to say out loud that the foundation is bad, even when the house is yours, even when the people inside it are the people you love most. I built my home in 1994 and it is still standing. The rafters I cut by hand, the concrete I poured on a cold October morning, the windows I set level with a transit exactly like the one Caleb carried up those dormitory stairs. It will be standing long after I am gone. That is the only kind of legacy that matters to me now. Not the money, not the property, not the accounts. The things you built honestly and left standing for someone worthy to inherit. My daughter came for Sunday dinner 6 weeks later. We didn't talk about any of it. We talked about Caleb's first assignment, which he had sent me a photo of, 12 pages on stormwater runoff management with a hand-drawn diagram that made me feel something I don't have a word for. We talked about the hydrangeas along the back fence, which had come back stronger this year than they had in a long time. After she left, I sat on the porch until the sun went all the way down. If you are listening to this, and you have someone in your life who mistakes your kindness for a blank check, hear me. The price of being trusted is not silence. It is not the slow draining of everything you spent a lifetime building. There is nothing noble about looking away when the people you love are looting the house. Sometimes the most loving thing a father can do is walk to the foundation, find the crack, and refuse to pour concrete over it one more time. Take care of each other, but take care of yourself first. Because a man who lets himself be hollowed out has nothing left to give. And the people who needed him most are the ones who end up paying for that silence. Check your accounts. Know what you've signed. And if someone is managing your affairs and telling you everything is fine, ask to see the numbers. The numbers will tell you what the words won't.